Database and database management systems. Entity relationship model. Entity relationship model is a detailed representation of the data in the organization, which are expressed in terms of entities in the business environment, the relationship or association among these entities, the attributes or properties of both the entities and their relationships. Entity is a component in a business process that can have many instances or records. Instance is the single record or occurrence of an entity. Each instance has a distinguished characteristic as well as one or more other descriptive pieces of data. The graphical representation of an ER model is an entity relationship diagram, or ER diagram, or ERD. Examples of entities are person, such as employee, students, patients. Places is also an entity, such as store, warehouse, estate. Objects is also an entity, such as machine, buildings, automobile. Event is also an entity. Sales, registration, renewal are just a few. A concept is also an entity, such as account, course, and work center. This table is a representation of an entity student. Record 1, Record 2, and Record 3 are the instances. There are several notations for ERD. When we say notation, these are simple rules on how to graphically express entity and the relationship in an ERD. We have here the basic notation. In basic notations, strong entity or entity that exists independently from other entity types. A weak entity type, on the other hand, are type whose existence depends on some other entity type. An associative entity is an entity that associates the instances of one or more entity types and contains attributes that are peculiar to the relationship between those entity instances. We have here the symbols for our basic notations. These are the 3 samples of our basic notations. This is Shen's ERD notation. For detailed explanation for this ERD notation, you can visit the link below the figure. And this is the crow's foot notation. Visit the links for details. An attribute is a property or characteristic of an entity or relationship type that is of interest to the organization. For example, we have a student entity and the organization is interested to the name, address, and birthday of the student. Since that these 3 data are the only data which interest the organization, we can say that these 3 are the only attribute for our students. In a database, entities are commonly the table and the properties or attribute is the tables field. In naming the attribute, make sure that it can be a singular noun or a noun phrase such as student ID, address, name, birthday, etc. Make sure that it is unique within the entity. In an entity, the attribute types are the following. Required attribute. An attribute that must have the value of every entity instances with which it is associated. Next is the simple or atomic attribute. This is the attribute that cannot be broken down into smaller components that are meaningful to the organization. Next is the optional attribute. This is the attribute that may not have the value for every entity. For example, the scholarship name. Not all students have a scholarship, so this is an optional attribute. Next is the composite attribute. This is the attribute that has meaningful component parts. Name is a composite attribute because it can be composed of last name, first name, middle name, and extension name. Next is multi-valued attribute, an attribute that may take on more than one value for a given entity. Talent is a multi-valued attribute because a student can have many talents. Derived attribute, an attribute whose value can be calculated from related attribute values, such as age. We can compute age by subtracting the birth date from the current date. The identifier, an attribute whose value distinguishes instances of the entity type. These are the primary keys. In our student table, a student ID will be unique reference of an instance of a student type. Composite identifier, an identifier that consists of a composite attribute such as a student number. This is a unique reference, and because its format has meaning such as year and last enrollment, course, branch, etc., this can be called composite identifier. A relationship in a data model is a word phrase to describe the association that represents the interaction among entities involved in a flow of data and information in an organizational function and processes. The existence of the relationship is an relationship instance. The number of entity that participates in the relationship defines the degree of relationship. Unary relationship is between instances of single entity. Binary or relationship in between two instances of two entities. Ternary relationship is a simultaneous relationship among the instances of three entity types. This is a good example of unary relationship. An employee table. Since the supervisor manages employees and supervisor is employee, we can say that the supervisor or the employee supervisor is related to the ordinary employees. Binary relationship is like this. Employee is assigned to parking space. That is one-to-one relationship. Product line contains products. So that is one-to-many. And a student is registered for courses or course. That is many-to-many relationship. Ternary relationship is the association of three or more entities, and it will look like this. Each relationship has cardinality. Cardinality pertains to the number of records or instances in an entity, files, or table. The rule that specifies the number of times that the instance of an entity is associated in an instance or other entity is what we called cardinality constraints. We have maximum cardinality for the maximum related records and minimum cardinality for minimum number of related instances. Mandatory cardinality, which means entities must relate once. And of course, the optional cardinality, which means the association is optional. So this is our example for our optional cardinality. The optional cardinality or association is represented by this 0, which means that our association allows 0 record of copy number that can be related to the movie name. Relational data model for database management is representation of the database as collection of relations commonly presented in a form of table. The three components of our relational data model are data structure, where data are organized in the form of tables with rows and columns. Data manipulation, which is a powerful operation, commonly by the use of SQL language. This is used to manipulate data stored in the relations. Data integrity. This is the defined mechanism to specify business rules that maintains the integrity of data when they are manipulated. Entity in a relational data model is presented in two-dimensional table data. Let us take a look of the example. We can present it as customers, having a attribute of customer ID, name, job title, and address. Customer ID is the primary key because it is the attribute that is uniquely identifies the row of our relationship. Sometimes, relational data model gives us an opportunity to assign a null or empty value to our attribute. But please be noted that the primary key should not have a null value. A null value is a value that may be assigned to the attribute when no other value applies or when the applicable value is unknown. In relational data model, identification of the foreign key is also important. Foreign key is an attribute in a relation that serves as a primary key of another table. Foreign key is typically physical manifestation of relationship between entity or tables in the database. For example, I have here orders. We can represent it as orders having the 4 fields, and our customer ID is the foreign key because customer ID is the foreign key of the customer table. Please be noted about these properties of a table. Number 1, each table in a database has a unique name. An entry at the intersection of each row and column is atomic or single value. There can be only one value association or associated with each attribute on a specific row or table. There should be no multi-valued attributes that are allowed in the relation. Each row is unique. No two rows in the relation can be identical. Each attribute within the table has a unique name. The sequence of columns is insignificant. And last, the sequence of rows is insignificant.